wooden fort stands alone in the frozen wilderness of the American frontier. Inside its walls, British regulars, colonial militia, and cannon aimed out over a flooded plain. Outside, an army has surrounded them. British scouts report hundreds of enemy soldiers, maybe more, closing in through the icy floodwater. The British commander, Henry Hamilton, has no choice. He orders the gates opened. He agrees to surrender one of Britain's strongest frontier strongholds. But here is the impossible truth. There is no army outside those walls. There are roughly 170 men, farmers, hunters, frontiersmen, soaked to the chest in freezing water, starving, exhausted past the point most soldiers could endure. They have no artillery train, no reinforcements, no supply line. Some of them have not eaten a full meal in 2 days, and somehow they are about to take the fort without firing more than a handful of shots. How does a force this small convince an experienced British officer that he is beaten? How do you defeat an enemy who outguns you, outsupplies you, and sits safely behind log walls and cannon? The answer is not more soldiers. The answer is what one man understood about fear, deception, and the limits of the human mind under siege. This is the story of George Rogers Clark and the impossible fall of Fort Sackville. To understand why this frozen fort mattered so much, you have to understand what the American Revolution actually looked like west of the mountains. While Washington's army fought along the Atlantic coast, an entirely different war was unfolding across the Illinois country and the Ohio Valley. This was Britain's northwest frontier, a vast, thinly settled territory of French villages, native nations, and isolated forts, all technically under British control since the end of the French and Indian War. For American settlers scattered across Kentucky and Virginia's western claims, this frontier was not a distant theater of war. It was the war. British agents were arming and encouraging native raiding parties against American settlements, and the settlers knew exactly who was arming them. Forts like Sackville, at the town of Vincennes on the Wabash River, were the nerve centers of that entire system. Whoever held Vincennes held influence over the surrounding native nations, controlled river trade, and projected British power deep into land the Americans desperately needed to protect. For a family in a cabin on the Kentucky frontier, Fort Sackville wasn't a line on a map hundreds of miles away. It was the source of the raiding parties that could appear at the tree line without warning. It was the reason men slept with a loaded rifle beside the door. Losing that fort, or holding it, could decide whether an entire settlement survived the next planting season. If the British held the Northwest, the frontier would keep bleeding. So a 25-year-old Virginian came forward with a plan so audacious that even his own government hesitated to fund it. What made Virginia's governor gamble an entire frontier campaign on a man barely out of his 20s? George Rogers Clark was not a career officer. He was a surveyor and frontiersman who understood the Ohio Valley better than most professional soldiers understood a map. What set him apart wasn't rank or training. It was a cold, almost unnerving calm under pressure, combined with a willingness to gamble everything on speed and surprise rather than numbers. Clark believed something most conventional officers refused to accept, that a small, fast-moving force could achieve what a large, slow one never could, if it struck before the enemy believed a strike was possible. Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry, authorized Clark's expedition, but quietly, and with barely enough men and supplies to make the attempt look plausible. Clark set out in the spring of 1778, with fewer than 200 men to seize British-held towns across the Illinois country. His first target was Kaskaskia, and what happened there should have been impossible too. Clark's men crossed hostile wilderness undetected and took the town in a single night, without a shot fired. The French inhabitants, expecting brutal treatment from American rebels, were stunned when Clark treated them with respect instead of retribution. That single decision changed everything. French settlers, still resentful of British rule since their conquest years earlier, began siding with Clark. Village after village along the Illinois came over to the American cause almost willingly. Clark's momentum seemed unstoppable. Vincennes itself and Fort Sackville fell into American hands without a fight, garrisoned by a small, sympathetic militia. Word of Clark's approach alone now seemed to be enough to bring towns over to the American side before he even arrived. For a brief moment it looked as if the northwest frontier might simply slip away from Britain without a real battle at all. A campaign that began with barely 200 men and almost no support from Virginia had, in a matter of months, flipped an entire region of the continent. That is exactly the moment when history tends to turn. Then everything Clark had built began to collapse in a single stroke. Henry Hamilton, the British lieutenant governor at Detroit, was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. Known among American settlers by a name meant to demonize him, he had spent years overseeing the very native alliances that terrorized frontier settlements. Now he marched south with a mixed force of British regulars, French volunteers, and native allies to take Vincennes back. Hamilton's march was long, difficult, and late in the season, arriving as winter set in. But it worked. Fort Sackville's thin garrison surrendered without serious resistance, and Hamilton settled in for the winter, confident that the frontier crisis was over. Clark, hundreds of miles away at Kaskaskia, received the news like a blow to the chest. Everything he had gained in a single fearless campaign had unraveled in weeks, and now came the decision that would define him. Waiting until spring was the safe choice. Spring would bring better weather, a stronger force, a real chance of reinforcement. Spring would also give Hamilton months to fortify Sackville, rebuild native alliances, and organize a devastating offensive against every American settlement in Kentucky. Clark understood something brutal. If he waited, he would be facing a far stronger enemy on Hamilton's terms. If he moved now, in the dead of winter, through flooded wilderness that no rational commander would attempt to cross, he might catch Hamilton before he was ready. No one crosses that country in February. That was exactly why it might work. Clark gathered roughly 170 men, a mix of American frontiersmen and French volunteers from the very villages he had won over months earlier, and set out on a march that military planners would later call one of the most brutal overland campaigns of the entire Revolutionary War. This is where the story stops being a matter of strategy and becomes a matter of raw human endurance. The path to Vincennes crossed the flooded lowlands of southern Illinois in the depths of winter. Weeks of rain and thaw had turned the landscape into a maze of swollen rivers, invisible creek beds, and endless freezing floodwater. Maps meant almost nothing here. The land itself had changed shape beneath the water. Picture it. Men wading chest-deep through water so cold it stole the breath from their lungs. Muskets and powder horns held high overhead, one slip meaning ruined gunpowder or a body swept downstream. Every step forward was a gamble against a current no one could see. Some stretches of the crossing had no dry ground at all. Men marched for hours through water that never dropped below the waist, emerging only to make freezing camp on whatever high ground they could find, with fires that barely warmed numbed hands before the march resumed. Wet wool clothing froze stiff overnight. Boots rotted apart. Some men wrapped their feet in rags just to keep walking. Then came the worst of it, a stretch of floodwater so deep that shorter men could no longer touch bottom at all. The column nearly stalled here, men hesitating at the edge of water that looked less like a river crossing and more like a lake with no far shore in sight. Clark did not order the weakest men forward first. He waded in himself, chest deep, while the column watched. Then the strongest swimmers formed a human chain, passing the exhausted and the smallest men hand to hand through the deepest section, so that no one crossed that stretch alone. It was not a maneuver from any military manual. It was improvisation born from watching men freeze in place at the edge of despair. Food ran out days before the fort came into view. What little remained was rationed to almost nothing, then to nothing at all. Clark's men existed on whatever scraps could be found in the flooded countryside, then marched on, will alone, through a landscape actively trying to kill them. Some accounts describe men so weakened by hunger and cold that they could barely stand without help from the man beside them, only to rise again and keep moving, because stopping meant something worse than exhaustion. Morale began to break. Men who had survived native raids and open combat without flinching found themselves pushed toward the edge by cold and hunger alone. Whispers moved through the column that the fort was still too far, that the water ahead might be worse, that no sane commander would attempt a crossing like this in February for a very good reason. Clark understood that if the march faltered now, with the fort still out of reach, the campaign would die without a single shot fired at the enemy. So he did something almost theatrical. He moved constantly among his exhausted men, refusing to show doubt, encouraging, physically supporting stragglers, pushing the column forward through sheer force of presence. Whether every detail of that moment has been preserved exactly as later told, historians still debate. What is certain is that the march itself was real, brutal, and very nearly fatal to the entire expedition before it ever reached the enemy. By the time Vincennes finally appeared on the horizon, Clark's men were soaked, starved, and pushed past ordinary human limits. Many could barely lift a musket, and yet somehow they were still moving forward. And Clark knew something else, something that would decide everything that followed. He did not have enough men, food, or ammunition to actually besiege Fort Sackville by conventional means. If Hamilton realized the true size and condition of the force outside his walls, the campaign was finished. So Clark chose deception instead of firepower. He had his exhausted column march and countermarch across open, visible ridgeline ground outside the fort, again and again, using terrain and timing so that the same roughly 170 men appeared from inside the walls to be several times their actual number. Flags were raised and repositioned, formations dissolved behind a tree line only to reappear moments later from a different angle, as though fresh companies kept arriving. He allowed captured messages and rumors to spread, exaggerating both his numbers and his intentions. Local townspeople, many already sympathetic to the Americans after Clark's earlier restraint at Kaskaskia, reinforced the impression that an overwhelming force had arrived, some perhaps out of genuine belief, others perhaps sensing which side was about to win and positioning themselves accordingly. Clark's men also opened fire on the fort itself with expert marksmanship, using cover, rooftops, and elevation to snipe at the fort's gun ports with startling accuracy. Any British gunner who approached a firing port risked being cut down before he could touch a cannon. Within hours, Hamilton's own artillery, the single greatest advantage his men held, became almost impossible to use at all. A fort's strongest weapon had been silenced not by a siege train, but by a handful of frontier marksmen who knew exactly where to aim and exactly how patient to be. This was the core of Clark's gamble. He could not outarm Hamilton, he could not outsupply him. But he could make Hamilton doubt everything: the size of the enemy, the safety of his own walls, and the loyalty of the town surrounding his fort. An enemy who cannot trust his own information is already losing the battle inside his own head, long before he loses it on the ground. Inside Fort Sackville, confusion took hold long before real danger did. Hamilton had expected, at worst, a small relief attempt from scattered American militia. Instead, his scouts and townspeople described an army materializing from country that should have been impassable in winter. Sniper fire made his own artillery unusable. Rumors multiplied by the hour. Enemy numbers grew with every report, each one more alarming than the last. No two accounts of the enemy's strength seemed to agree, and that disagreement itself became its own kind of terror. If no one could say how large the force outside really was, the only safe assumption was that it might be larger than anyone had said. Hamilton's own garrison was smaller and less experienced than the force he believed faced him. Some of his men were locals with divided loyalties, uncertain whether to fight for a cause that was clearly losing support in the surrounding town. Every hour of uncertainty ate away at the fort's will to resist. Men on the walls strained to see through the winter haze, catching glimpses of flags and moving figures that never quite resolved into a countable number. Clark understood exactly what was happening inside those walls, because it was exactly what he had engineered. Fear needs very little real information to grow. It only needs uncertainty, and uncertainty was the one resource Clark had in abundance. The final negotiations stretched out with agonizing tension. Messages passed back and forth between the fort and Clark's position under flags of truce. Hamilton, still unsure of the true size of the force outside, tried to negotiate terms that would preserve some dignity, some delay, some hope that a relief column might yet appear. Clark refused to soften his position, understanding that any sign of weakness now would unravel the entire deception in an instant. He demanded unconditional surrender, and held that line even as Hamilton pressed for better terms. At one tense point in the standoff, prisoners taken during the approach were dealt with in full view of the fort's walls, a brutal and deliberate display meant to remove any remaining doubt about Clark's resolve. It was a hard, ugly moment in an otherwise disciplined campaign, and it worked exactly as Clark intended. It told Hamilton, without another word needing to be said, that this was not a bluff he could afford to call. Silence stretched between messages. Somewhere behind those log walls, an experienced British officer weighed his garrison's dwindling confidence, his unusable artillery, and reports of an enemy force he could not verify and could not risk testing. On February 25, 1779, the gates of Fort Sackville opened. Henry Hamilton surrendered Fort Sackville to a force a fraction the size of what he believed he was facing. The frontier's most important British stronghold fell not to cannon fire or a superior army, but to psychological pressure built from marksmanship, rumour, timing and nerve. The consequences reached far beyond one frozen fort on the Wabash. Clark's campaign broke British momentum across the entire northwest frontier and gave the fledgling United States a legitimate claim to the vast Illinois country during the peace negotiations that would eventually end the war. When American and British diplomats sat down to draw the borders of a new nation in the Treaty of Paris, Clark's campaign was part of the reason those borders extended west to the Mississippi, rather than stopping at the mountains. Without that claim, the Northwest Territory, as later organized by the United States government, might never have existed in the same form. States that would one day include Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin trace part of their national origin to a campaign fought by roughly 170 half-frozen volunteers who crossed water that should have stopped them. It is worth pausing on how easily this could have gone the other way. A single failed crossing, a single moment of collapsed morale in that floodwater, a single moment where Hamilton called the bluff instead of believing it, and the outcome of an entire territorial claim might have been written differently. The margin between the history we know and a very different one was measured in frozen inches of floodwater and the nerve of a small group of exhausted men. Clark himself never received the resources or recognition that matched what he achieved. He spent much of his later life in financial hardship, overshadowed by better-funded, better-connected officers whose campaigns are remembered more prominently. History does not always reward its most decisive figures fairly, but the facts of what happened at Fort Sackville remain undeniable. George Rogers Clark did not possess the largest army. He did not have the strongest fort, the deepest supplies, or the safest path forward. What he had was leadership forged in impossible conditions, endurance that pushed exhausted men past their breaking point without breaking them, and the psychological instinct to make an enemy defeat himself before a real battle ever had the chance to begin. Sometimes history is not decided by the side with the most soldiers. Sometimes it is decided by the side willing to walk through freezing water when everyone else believed it could not be done.